Carbon fee and dividend, Capitol Hill. All right, come on in and have a seat, folks. All right, welcome back from lunch. It's good to see you. So I want to start with a little story from 2012. That's when I first met Ricky Bradley, who I think is back there somewhere and who's now our IT director. Back then, he and I were both pretty new volunteers in a much smaller CCL and a much younger CCL. And we both met here at the National Conference, of course. He was from Texas. I was from Wisconsin. We had a lot of fun. We had a little rivalry going on. I think Ricky was a little peeved that Wisconsin had about 3 times as many people here as Texas did. And he made a bet, we made a bet that the next year, whoever had more people here would have to buy the other one a drink. Well, I figured I was going to win no matter what, right? Because either Wisconsin was going to win or we were all going to win, because when we had more people from Texas here, we were going to be way more farther down the path to what we needed to get done to pass carbon fee and dividend, solve the climate crisis. So it was a no-win thing for me. It was just, had to win that way. All right, so fast forward to this year. We're an organization that is not afraid to give ourselves big stretch goals. And the regional coordinators and I, as you've heard, set ourselves this big crazy goal of having a constituent come from every district in the United States. And, you know, that was going to be easy in some states, really hard in others. And Susan Adams was our new regional coordinator. She just stepped up in the Third Coast, which covers Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. And you should have seen the look on her face when I proposed that goal. I think the word was terror. And, but, you know, she took it on, and her team did. And they got all of Louisiana, they got all of Mississippi, and they got a lot of Texas. And then around mid-May, things seemed to stall there. And then this interesting thing happened where Sabrina Fu, and John Clark, our regional coordinators in the Mid-Atlantic region, they reached that goal for that whole region of a constituent from every district, yeah. And Sabrina didn't just, you know, stop there. She turned around and gave us all that confidence and started helping in the Third Coast. And so she started helping with phone calls. And Cathy Arlinsky in California started helping to reach out in Texas. And they went from having 8 uncovered districts out of 36 to having just 4 left. And then Susan Adams mentioned to me that she really could use a little more scholarship money, because Texas had raised this nice amount and they'd given out every bit of it already. And when I mentioned that to some people back in Wisconsin, bless their hearts, Wisconsin people started sending money to the Texas Scholarship Fund. So, congratulations, everybody. And, you know, why does that matter? What's the point of this? Well, this is a team sport, right? That is the point. And people are always telling us that we can't do what we say we're going to do. You know, we can't get Congress to work together. We can't get Republicans, that's what they say. We can't get Republicans and Democrats to go in on a bill together. We can't get this meeting or that. We can't get all of Texas. Well, we did. So this is a team sport, and what I want you to walk away with is every success in every corner of the country belongs to all of you and all of us. There are other stories I could tell you. For example, how Portland, Oregon helped to get Hawaii here, and things that went on to help get North Dakota here, because we are all in this together. All right. So welcome again to the Sunday afternoon planning plenary. And as you heard from Mark this morning, thanks to your good work and the work of our DC staff and the work of Jay Butera and the work of our allies, we got closer than we ever have to getting a bipartisan bill introduced. And because of that progress that we were making in conversations with members of Congress, we took seriously the need to get ready. And so staff put a lot of time into preparing for a carbon fee and dividend bill to get dropped. And that included things like planning out in detail how we would communicate with you about provisions of the bill. It included hiring a PR firm to help with media and messaging when that happens. It included how would we work with our allies on this, and just a lot of other organizational details. And then, of course, as you know, if you've been around for a little bit, you know that we asked you to get ready too. And that's because we want to hit the ground running when that happens. All right, so it's amazing to me to stand up here and tell you how good things have been looking, particularly given all the other things happening in the country. All right, so obviously it didn't happen yet. Our DC staff plans to spend the next 6 months getting things in place for introduction in January. Now, maybe that will happen sooner, maybe it will happen later, but again, they're working hard on that. And we need you to spend the next 6 months doing the same thing, all right? So that when the new Congress comes in, we're ready. And that may look like doing the same thing as always, but that's because a lot of what we're doing has been working. Some of it is the same. What we've been doing has enabled 39 pairs of Democrats and Republicans to join the Climate Solutions Caucus. It's enabled carbon fee and dividend to be on the table as a major solution to the problem. It's enabled us as an organization to grow in size and reputation in the country. And I do want to say yes, with increased invisibility and influence comes increased criticism. And we just need to deal with that in the same way that we deal with everything, in the respectful, focused, relational, and persistent way that we do everything. All right. So this work has enabled conversations to take place in DC offices that we've never had before, and with more Republicans than we've ever had before. Okay. But we aren't there yet, and there's a long road ahead of us. And as monumental as it's going to be to get Republicans and Democrats on a bill together, getting that legislation passed is an even bigger mountain to climb. So this isn't for the faint of heart. We know that. But we're here because we're convinced it must be done. So we're going to do 3 things in this hour. First of all, we want you to know what your staff is thinking and doing at this point in time about our way forward. And we want you to also be able to give your input into strategy. And we want to go over our volunteer action plan for the next 6 months, for the rest of this year, so that we're in the strongest possible position for bill introduction with the new Congress. All right. And then after today, you're going to go off, after this session, you're going to go off then into breakout sessions with your regional and state coordinators. And then tomorrow you'll have a day to think and learn and plan and connect some more. And Tuesday, you're going to take your relationships with members of Congress to the next level, wherever they are, and in some cases, you're going to be talking sponsorship. In some cases, you're going to be just figuring out how do we just get them a little bit out of the way, but whatever it is, the next level. It's realism. And then you're going to go home, and you're going to make great things happen there. Okay. So a lot of times in this plenary, I've had a few volunteers come up and share success stories, because there's always these wonderful, amazing things that are happening out there. And I'm not doing that this year, but not because there aren't inspiring stories. And so just a couple of mentions. There were things like the volunteers in Florida deciding, in spite of, and in some ways because of Hurricane Irma, that they were going to go ahead with the Florida tour that they had planned that was 2 weeks after Hurricane Irma. Yeah. It included the state legislature of Utah passing a resolution, a climate change resolution, with 2/3 of Republicans in the state voting in favor of it. Utah. And they did that because of the work of high school students in the state, including CCLers. And then chapters across the U.S. have passed 94 now, with one having just come in a few days ago, city, state, and county resolutions in support of carbon fee and dividend. So a lot of wonderful, inspiring work. Okay. But we also hear that it's been really tough out there, you know, living through these political times that we're in and seeing persistent attacks on science and on important established environmental policies. You know, and so we've been hearing that you want a plan for how our work's going to be done. So that's why in this session I've asked Danny to share his bill introduction plan, Danny Richter, and I've asked Jamie DeMarco to share our state level work, and I've asked Cathy Orlando to share what's happening internationally, and then Tony Sirna will come up and get you involved in sharing your ideas for moving ahead. So I'm just going to turn things right over to Danny, who is ready right here, and let him take that away.
Hi, everybody. That was awesome. Well, thank you, everyone, for being here. It's great to be on the same team as so many wonderful and dedicated people willing to spend their time and money to come here to DC. I'm hopeful that in this next session, I will be able to orient you to how CCL is approaching the, I'm going to use the word crazy politics that we're all in. Pretty hard to navigate, but hopefully I can point you in a direction that proves fruitful for climate action and for our team's goals. So first of all, what are the major moving parts? What are the big things that are defining our crazy politics at the moment that are constraining our strategy? So first of all, it's an election year, and we are on the cusp of campaign season. And if you actually look at the calendar, there are only 10 more weeks of work scheduled in the House and 11 weeks of campaigning scheduled. So when you go in on Tuesday, your members of Congress are really going to be in campaign mode. Coming back to work is going to be a mental shift. So that's something to be aware of. Another thing that we're seeing is record numbers of Republicans retiring from the House. When you add together the 23 Democrats and Republicans who have already left and the 53 Democrats and Republicans who have already announced they're retiring, and you throw in some of the toss-up races which could flip, we could be looking at almost a quarter of the House, which is new in the next Congress. And so that means that a lot of you are going to be talking to people who are retiring, who have already announced they're retiring. That poses some challenges for you. But in what remains of this year, it also poses some opportunities. It's an opportunity to meet a lot of new candidates, make that wonderful first impression. And if the membership of the caucus is any indication, new people in the Congress are good targets. The third thing that I'll point out is it is widely expected that Democrats will retake the House. Right now, the most recent numbers that I have seen are that there is a 2 out of 3 chance that Democrats will take the House. It is possible that they might take the Senate, but that is less likely. A lot can happen in 21 weeks, but that's the current prognosis. And this would be the first time since 2010 that Democrats would be in charge of the House. So looking at this, and with our goals of passage, a theme throughout my talk this afternoon and this evening is going to be bipartisanship. This emphasis comes from thinking through what is going to need to happen in order to pass a bill. We're going to need to pass the House with a majority. That's 219 votes. We're going to need to pass the Senate beating the filibuster. That is 60 votes. 60 votes. Maybe the Democrats take the Senate, but they're not going to get to 60 votes. They're not going to get there this Congress. They're not going to get there next Congress. Very unlikely they're going to get there the Congress after that. We are locked into needing at least 8 to 12 Republicans in the Senate in order to pass this. And so we're firmly in the bipartisan space still. Next, this is going to need to be signed by President Trump. He hasn't been exactly a friend to climate action in his statements. So while he does style himself a deal maker, and maybe if this were to come before his desk, maybe he would find a way to present this as a deal. But I think we also have to reckon with what if he chooses to veto it. That means 290 votes in the House and 66 votes in the Senate. So how do we get there? I've said this before, I'm going to say it right now. Again, we need to change the hearts and minds of the Republican base. We need to remind them that it is a conservative value to conserve. Just as we, and this is, this is how we've gotten major environmental legislation passed and enacted in the past, is with wide majorities of both parties passing this into law, signed into law by Republican presidents, and that's the first paragraph of your one-page leave behind. We're trying to remind Congress of that as well. And so why do I think we can change the hearts and minds of the Republican base? Well, first of all, I think that the research of Professor Bruley at Drexel University has shown correlation, though not necessarily causation, between what political elites, and what he means there is elected members of Congress, saying on climate and what the public believes. Dr. Celia Paris, who was our February speaker, reminded of this, and I recently re-listened to that call, and my takeaway from her message at the time, and when I listened to it again, I had the same impression. Her take-home message was, bipartisanship is sexy. Bipartisanship gets people elected. In polls, strong majorities say they want elected officials to cooperate across political lines. They want them to be respectful to each other. They want them to compromise. Polls find that people tend to support bipartisan policies, and Dr. Paris went so far as to even encourage us at our next meeting, which would be Tuesday, to remind members of Congress that they do serve in this role as being a political elite. It's not one way. They don't have to respond completely to polls. They can influence what their base believes. They are leaders. And the thing about her talk that really, really stuck out to me was that opposite party voters, the ones that you need to win, they like the legislator better when he or she engages in bipartisan cooperation. And there is no penalty from same-party voters, except for immigrants on immigration. Bipartisan legislators are seen as listening to voters and less self-interested, and that is there's a real benefit in their reputation. It also increases public support for the policy. And we know that that is important because we're learning in this crazy politics that legislation is not bipartisan, can be repealed. It is used as a political wedge to divide the parties further. So another thing that I've found very useful in figuring out how do we create this cultural shift is the Climate Solutions Caucus. And I found the caucus to be both active and transformational. The caucus is active because they are having quarterly member-level meetings. At these meetings, you're getting 15 to 20 members of the caucus, a good bipartisan mix, who are showing up and fulfilling the stated mission of the caucus, which is to educate them about climate solutions. They are being educated, they're showing up. I told a colleague at the Environmental Defense Fund that they were meeting approximately quarterly, and her reaction was one of surprise. Wow, if you're even meeting once a year, you're beating the vast majority of caucuses. And here they are meeting quarterly. So that's just some perspective on what is expected and how far above and beyond the caucus is going. So the caucus is active. I've also seen the caucus be transformational. The League of Conservation voters recently released their scores for the past year, and with it they actually chose to single out the Republicans in that score of the Climate Solutions Caucus and how they were doing. And what they did is they compared that to the Democrats, and what evolved was kind of a negative view of Republicans. But our communications coordinator, Plenary Winchester, took a closer look at that. And she actually compared Republicans on the caucus to the Republican caucus as a whole. And she found, which I would argue is the appropriate comparison when dealing with an issue which has been treated as a wedge issue. And she found that the caucus Republicans were 11 points above in their LCV score the Republican caucus as a whole. I find this remarkable because at that time, over half the Republicans on the caucus had been there less than a year. So the fact that you could detect any change at all given that over half of them had been there less than a year, I think that that's remarkable. I think it's even more remarkable given that when you look at the 35 votes that they included in that score, only 5 of them were climate. That suggests to me that maybe by being on the caucus, not only are the ones who are there, had been there long enough, are taking good votes on the climate, there might be some spillover to other environmental issues. But the thing that convinces me more than anything that the caucus is transformational is this recent quote from May 15th in The Hill from Congressman Gates. And Congressman Gates is in a safe district. He's going to be reelected. He is a Republican's Republican. Nobody questions his conservative credentials. And yet, in an article which is totally unrelated to climate, totally unrelated, this is his quote: "We need to focus on the issues that win the future. You know, how we engage in digital commerce, issues like climate change, issues like cannabis reform." That is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about elite cues. That is an elite cue. That is a Republican who's coming back. This is a Republican who has no reason to be on the caucus except he cares about the climate. This is the Republican in a totally unrelated context is bringing the climate into the context. That is an elite cue. That is what I'm talking about. That is how we are going to change the hearts and minds of the Republican base. We need more of that. But this is a clear indication that this is working. And more on how this is working. I think that there is a possibility of an analogy we're all familiar with, being climate advocates, the frog and the boiling pot of water. You know, a frog who jumps in a boiling pot of water is going to jump right out. A frog who is put in a room temperature pot of water and you slowly increase the heat will just boil to death. I think we're humans, and I think that that human tendency is being applied right now on Republican action on climate. I want to go back to before we turned the heat up on this water. I want to go back to 2014, September 2014, when I was told it was literally impossible to get a Republican in the House to say climate change is real, humans have had an impact, and Congress should do something about it. And yet in that month, Congressman Gibson said I would introduce a resolution that says exactly that, said yes to CCL constituents. Then I was told it would be impossible for Congressman Gibson to get 9 other Republicans to join him in actually introducing that. Yet, a week before the Pope spoke to Congress, including climate change, he did just that. He introduced it with a total of 11 Republicans, introduced that resolution, and by the end of that Congress it had 17, including 2 Freedom Caucus members, which was also supposed to have been impossible. I was told it would be impossible to get a caucus with the word climate in it. And yet, in February of 2016, you have Congressman Deutsch and Congressman Curbelo forming the Climate Solutions Caucus. I was then told it would be impossible for that caucus to get to 10 members, to 20 members, to 30 members, to 40 members, etc. I think they've stopped now, but of course we sit now at 78 members. But now, we're being told it is impossible that the Climate Solutions Caucus would do anything significant. And yet, as part of the budget bill, which passed earlier this year, there was a bill that was included, H.R. 1090. It was a bill that was introduced by a Republican, Congressman Reed, out of New York. It was the Technologies for Energy Security Act of 2017. It had 117 co-sponsors, a large portion of the members of the caucus, because the caucus was pushing this bill. It was pushing this bill to its members, and it is in there, and I think it is in there because of the Climate Solutions Caucus. This is the law of the land. So I don't want to hear about impossible. And I do want to talk about the Yale project on climate communications and some of the stuff that they're putting out. Support for climate action is high, despite elite cues from the president to the contrary. So you see it for the last 2 years, the view of Americans, 7 out of 10 Americans think that global warming is happening, and they have for the past 2 years. This is remarkable. How is this possible if the president is putting out these consistent elite cues that no, it isn't happening? Well, It may be that they trust their members of Congress more than they trust the president. It may be that they generally don't trust the president. But what are we to do with this? I have a hypothesis. So for a long time, it has been a primary goal of climate advocates to increase the saliency of our issue. And this has proven difficult and dependent on a healthy economy. And even now, when unemployment is at a record low and the economy is riding a 9-year growth period, climate remains a low saliency issue. Here in this table, also from the Yale Project on Climate Communications, you see that it is the 15th out of 28 issues for all voters. And for moderate Democrats, it is a number 16 issue. And for liberal or moderate Republicans, it is the number 23 most salient issue. So my hypothesis, what if instead of treating this as a bug of the system, what if we were to treat this as a feature? What if this is something we can't change? What would that look like? Maybe this is such a non-salient issue for so many voters over so long a period. Maybe the way to handle this is to treat this not as a wedge issue, but as a bridge issue. What if instead of trying to treat climate as some way to distinguish yourself from the other party, what if we were to treat this as a way in which you could get a little piece of that sexy and say, you know, I can work with other members across the aisle, I can collaborate with them, I can compromise, I can introduce and I can pass legislation that, according to polling, makes you like me more, makes me more likely to get your votes. If you look at just the raw numbers, you, on the base, from Celia Paris, you got the base on the Democratic side, on the Republican side, you got the base already. If you talk about climate, you're going to suffer no penalty, but if you talk about climate in a bipartisan way, you might just pick off some of those voters in the middle. Maybe the way to handle an existential crisis is not to fight over it, but to recognize the humanity in others, thank them for the small steps they do take, and work together. So now back to our bill. You've heard Mark talk about this, you've heard Madeleine talk about this, and a little bit more perspective on that. Prior to this Congress, I'd been able to engage a total of 3 Republican offices in meaningful conversations about the details of our extended bill text. 3, over a period of 5 years. And over the past year, I was able to engage a total of 11 offices. I should say, with, of course, my team. This wasn't just me, all right? And also, in a lot of these things, it was because of the constituents. And I'm not just saying that. 100% no doubt. It's because you referred them to the team. And not only were we engaging these 11 offices individually, but they were meeting as a group. And some of you have been around for a while, you may remember this is one of the highest value asks that we had, supporting us meet with other Republicans to discuss this. And I actually literally found myself pinching myself coming out of some of these meetings just to make sure that I wasn't dreaming this. It was so thrilling to be having these conversations to get this kind of feedback. But the current status of that effort is that it is stalled. And my read on why that is because we got too close to the election. The need to fundraise, the concern about primaries, the concern about generals, that has stalled this effort. So as Madeleine said, we could plan for the new Congress, and I could, but I also think we should try and unstuck this process. And if you think about how would we unstuck something like this, having 1,200 constituents go onto Capitol Hill and lobby their members of Congress, that's actually pretty good. That might just work. So that's your mission on Tuesday. We're going to try and see if we can unstuck this process, and if we can't, at the minimum, we're going to try and grease the skids so that we can slide right into the new Congress ready to go, get introduction as early as possible. So what can you do on Tuesday to help unstuck things or set us up for the new year? Let's start with the Democrats. They are expecting to be in the driver's seat next Congress, and there will be a strong temptation to politicize everything, including climate. And I fear that this will make it harder for Republicans to get on board. So we're asking them to commit to bipartisan action on climate, to use this issue as a bridge, not a wedge, Acknowledge the good things that Republicans are doing, even if they seem small. This is a world apart from where we used to be. Let's not be the frog that just stays in the water. This is really significant, and let's acknowledge that that water is heating up. There is more energy there. So we're going to ask them to do that. Treat it as a bridge, not a wedge. The physics of the planet demands more than regulations or state and local action alone. It demands congressional action. And keeping climate bills bipartisan helps us get there. There's plenty of other topics on which we can have our partisan fights. For Republicans, we either need to unstuck the current process or start laying the groundwork for early introduction next Congress. More Republicans to the party can help with that. So in your Making an Ask document, it's the green one in your folder. You don't need to take it out now. I'll go over it in more detail this evening. But on the first page, there's an if. If you have a good meeting with a member of Congress, if the Republican you're talking with likes what we're saying and believes it has merit, then we want you to invite them, say, if there were a discussion with Republicans on this topic, would you be interested in joining that discussion? So if Republicans were talking about this legislation, would you be interested in joining that discussion? And then I want you to tell me. And what we'll do is we'll get one of the Republicans we have been talking to, we'll get them to call them up. And then it's really real. So you don't need to tell them there's really been a discussion. You don't need to try and convince them of that. The thing that's really going to convince them is when they get that call from their Republican colleague. I also want to remind you that if you do get that yes, please do keep it confidential. So there is on Tuesday the share out, and one thing that could scare them off quicker than anything is seeing somebody come in or a reporter come in and saying, hey, I heard you wanted to be a part of this conversation. We don't want that. So please do keep it confidential. So that's the orientation to the landscape we're seeing, and Madeleine, I'll turn it back over to you.
So next up, well, first of all, thank you, Danny. And there will be time for Q&A when he's back on later tonight, right, Danny? Yeah, we just couldn't fit that in right now. So we're going to have Jamie DeMarco come up next, and I want to, Danny, did you take, nope, there it is. Whoop. There we go. Where is Jamie? Stealthy and effective. Jamie's one of the newer members of our staff, and he works in our DC office, but his job is to make sure that, to provide support to the parts of the country where it makes sense to pursue state carbon pricing legislation. And he's on his way to helping Washington State as soon as this conference is over. So take it away.
Hello, everyone. I am just here to tell you what you already know. CCL is laser focused on passing national carbon fee and dividend legislation. Woo! And to do that, we have pulled very hard for a very long time on every lever of political will available to us. Now, though, there is a fresh, new way to build political will for Congress to act on climate. And that is passing state-level carbon fees. State-level policies influence members of Congress because companies would much rather keep track of one simple national policy than to juggle a dozen different state-level policies. This effect is incredible. You would be amazed at how transformational it is. Just 2 weeks ago, I was at a meeting with a member representing the Maryland Climate Commission. And this representative of the Maryland the Maryland Chamber of Commerce. And this representative from the Maryland Chamber of Commerce was there, and he was talking about a proposed carbon tax. And he said, "Carbon tax in Maryland? That's nonsense. This is madness. It'll never work. It's a bad, bad, terrible idea, and it'll never, never happen." Then he straightened up, adjusted his tie, and said, "What we need instead is a national price on carbon." And I sat there dumbfounded. Other than proposing a Maryland carbon fee, I don't think there's anything we could have done that would have gotten that man to say those words. So what are we doing to engage in this incredible tactic? Already, CCL volunteers, on top of their work with members of Congress, are plugging into or even running state-level carbon pricing campaigns in DC, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Utah, Washington, and more. We are also, and we are also running an online incubator course trained to give volunteers who live in districts that don't yet have a price on carbon the skills that they need to get a bill introduced in January of 2019. And we have participants from Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. So hopefully we'll get all those states too to have bills. And I will say that you can clap after this one. This year, working in Utah, CCL volunteers helped to get introduced the first ever bipartisan carbon pricing bill in the United States. So there is a lot going on, but the thing is that nobody's done it. All of these states, and not a single one of them, has passed a carbon fee. And when no one has done something, everyone thinks it's impossible and it can't be done. A good example of this, raise your hand if you think it is possible to run a mile in less than 4 minutes. A lot of hands. So now we think it's possible. For centuries, everyone knew it was impossible because nobody had done it. Centuries. And then one day, someone did it. And the unbelievable thing is that within 8 weeks of the first person ever to do it, 2 more people had done it. And then it was though everybody could do it. Today there are more than 1,000 people who have run a sub 4-minute mile. When you do what everyone knows is impossible, you make it possible for everyone. When you do what everyone knows is impossible, you make it possible for everyone. And right now, there are a lot of people telling us that carbon fee and dividend is impossible, which is why we need a state to do it and make it possible for everyone, including Congress. And the good news is that in November, voters in Washington state will get to decide through a ballot initiative whether to enact the country's first ever carbon fee. Yeah, it's exciting. The policy being put forward is not revenue neutral, and I understand if you don't want to touch such a policy with a 10-foot pole. I think it's great policy. CCL National is supporting it. CCL Washington State is supporting it, and it aligns with our values, if not our exact policy. If you do want to help, look for an email in July. We will be asking everyone in CCL to call people who live in Washington State, phone bank Washington State, and ask people to be supportive in the ballot. Let's make sure that the next time a member of Congress says to us, carbon pricing, that's impossible, it can't be done, we can correct them and say it is possible because we've done it. Thank you.
I think that was a great hire. So, before we go on to Cathy, there's one thing that's come up. Catherine Gage, wherever you are, could you make your way to the back? Your dad is just wanting to connect with you. So, Catherine Gage, to the back to your dad, please. Okay, Cathy, come on up. All right. So This is Cathy Orlando. She has been doing such great work in Canada that the Canadian Senate gave her a medal not too long ago. And we decided to let her loose on the whole world, so go ahead.
Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Madeleine. I have only 5 minutes to summarize to you all that's been going on around the world. Yeah, you should be laughing. I'll do a very quick summary and follow that up with two short stories. But before I do that, anyone who is associated with a group outside the USA, please stand up. Anyone? Thank you. So just welcoming David Michael Charangwa from Nigeria, Ferpa Lama from Nepal, Clive Ellsworth from the United Kingdom, Matilda Zoderman from Sweden, Tammy Kellogg from Panama. I'm going to miss people. I'm Canadian. I'm going to apologize in advance. And also, and a welcome to the dozen or so Canadians in the room. And I am Canadian as well, if you did not know that. Since September 2017, I've been working as the International Outreach Manager, and since that time, we have introduced 6 new countries to our Citizens Climate Lobby family, including CCL, Colombia, Ireland, Madagascar, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and most recently, Pakistan. For your notes, that's 43 countries, and I just would like to congratulate CCL Sweden on their first national conference yesterday. Wish best of luck to CCL Germany on their 4th national conference tomorrow in Berlin. And best of luck to the whole continent of Africa that is aiming for a conference in September. I only have time to give you 2 short stories. The first story comes out of Portugal, and James Collis in this picture here, he lives in Portugal, and unlike Canada and the United States, they don't have representatives in their federal legislation. They have proportional representation. Thus, James made a very conscious decision to focus on grass tops lobbying. And what he's been doing since 2015 is pulling together a coalition of top environmental groups that are known to lobby effectively the Portuguese government. They came up with a carbon pricing policy they could all agree on, and yeah, it was an awful lot like carbon fee and dividend. And thereafter, they have lobbied within the federal government in Portugal 3 times, getting higher and higher up. This is an ongoing, evolving process. Lots of things are actually being cleared out of the way, and I congratulate James on being quite intentional and focused on solving the gridlock on less than ideal carbon pricing policies in Europe as well as in Portugal. Another story comes from Citizens Climate Lobby in Panama. Earlier this spring, a call went out in the environmental NGOs that they needed help with the greenhouse gas emissions in the International Maritime Organization, which is responsible for shipping of our goods all over the planet. They have 2.2% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from the International Maritime Organization. That's larger than Canada's carbon footprint, and they were set to double by 2050. I hooked up CCL Panama members, Tammy Kellogg and her group with NGOs involved with the IMO. They lobbied the appropriate officials within Panama. They wrote editorials, and look what happened. Instead of doubling emissions by 2050, the International Maritime Organization is going to half that, and Citizens Climate Lobby was part of that. That is huge. Thank you. I'm going to look right in the camera if I can. Because of all the work you are all doing out there, I have this amazing feeling inside of me all the time that we are becoming too connected to fail. We are winning, and we are going to win.
So you've heard from some of your staff now, and we also want to hear from you. So we're going to have Tony come on up and talk about our strategic planning process and ways that you will be able to work with us and him on that. Here we go.
Okay. Thank you, Madeleine. So, as Mark mentioned earlier, I'm CCL strategy coordinator now, and I've been working with the staff for the last year on issues of planning, goal setting, and strategy. And so today I want to share some tools with you, give you some of our best thinking on strategy, and provide you a system for participating in our strategic planning. Planning our work in Citizens Climate Lobby is a challenge because the political environment we work in is difficult to predict. Organizational strategists sometimes use a term borrowed from the military to describe our situation. VUCA. Oops, one more. There we go. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. VUCA. So in politics, you're almost always in a VUCA environment. But as they say now more than ever, as Danny mentioned, with the midterm elections coming up, there's an extra dose of uncertainty. Who will control the House? Who will control the Senate? Who will my member of Congress even be? So how can we possibly plan in such an environment? A common tool is called scenario planning. With scenario planning, you lay out all the possible scenarios the future might bring and consider what is needed to thrive and succeed in each scenario. When we look past the midterms, we can see a few key scenarios based on who ends up controlling each House of Congress. As Danny mentioned, for any chance of passing an enduring carbon fee and dividend bill, we need bipartisan support. So here, despite these different outcomes, scenario planning shows us that the path forward is a bipartisan path. But sometimes it's not so simple. Let's say you're in a competitive district where you might have a new member of Congress after the election. What are your likely scenarios? Well, you'll either have a Republican or a Democrat, we know that, or, well, most of the time. Okay, that seems pretty obvious, but it could make a very big difference for you and your chapter, as you're in your district, in your state. What does your CCL look like? What does your CCL work look like in those scenarios? What will you be asking from your members of Congress? What will their main agenda be? What concerns would they have with our policy? What relationships do you want with them? And what community leaders would be most influential to them? Here, your scenario might be quite different depending on the election outcome. So how do you prepare? What do you do now? What do you do now during this time of uncertainty? The trick is to prepare as if both scenarios will be true. If you have the resources, you can do your best to plan for both futures so that whichever happens, you'll be ready. So even with all this uncertainty, we still need to plan our CCL work for the next 6 months to help us be in the strongest possible position for bill introduction. Soon, Madeleine will share with you some of the ideas for what our work might look like in the next year. Like most things in CCL, we trust you to decide what is best for your district or state. And I'm hoping scenario planning can help you in that process. So let's give it a try right now. Think about what scenarios you need to prepare for. National scenarios like who controls Congress, and local scenarios like who your members of Congress will be, or even how your chapter might be changing over the next 6 months. In a minute, I'll ask you to break up into small groups of 3 or 4 people where you'll each have a minute to share 1 or 2 concrete actions that you or your chapter can do over the next 6 months that will help you be in a strong position regardless of what that future holds. Okay, so you're just going to turn to people close to you. Doesn't have to be a big deal. Just find 3 or 4 people, and we're going to look at the question of, what does the future hold for you over this next 6 to 9 months? Great. Okay, one more minute. Okay, if you hear me, raise your hand. We'll quiet back down. Okay, thank you. All right, good job, good job. Okay, so that obviously was not enough time to plan the rest of your year, and I'm sure there are still tons of unanswered questions out there, and that's fine. These are ideas and tools we hope you'll take with you into your regional planning sessions and take home with you to your local chapters. And now for an invitation. I'm creating a new strategic planning action team to help CCLers plan for our volatile future and think strategically as they work to achieve their goals. If this kind of thinking appeals to you and you want more, you can join me there to help in that planning. We'll have monthly meetings, phone calls starting in July, and if you'd like to join, you can sign up now on CCL Community at cclusa.org/strategy. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to succeeding with you in whatever future unfolds for us. Thank you.
New hire, old hire, they're all good hires. Okay, so you've heard from some of your staff. The rest are equally wonderful. I just want to do one more thing before we transition to your regional and state breakouts, all right? And the location of those regional breakouts can be found in your program book. But before that, I'm going to go over the volunteer action plan that we referred to. You can take it out or not, or you can save it for when you're in the breakout. I'm going to go over the first page. It's this yellow one. You can hear the Velcro. Yeah. All right, so we intend to get carbon fee and dividend introduced with Republican and Democratic sponsors, possibly yet this year, more likely early in 2019. So our DC office is going to be working extremely hard behind the scenes, and the volunteer action plan is your part. All right. It's 4 pages, but I put the top priorities on page 1, and I'm just going to read them out loud to you real quick right now, and then your regional and state coordinators will work with you on adapting those and implementing them in your area. Okay, so the goal is to enter 2019 strongly positioned for quick introduction of a bipartisan fee and dividend bill in the next Congress. All right, and this document lays out guidance from CCL staff on how best to use the next 6 months. We trust, as has been said, that each group will do what's appropriate for your local politics and volunteer resources. So the top 3 areas to focus on are, first of all, relationships with your current or future members of House, because as Danny said, there's a lot of turnover coming. So during campaign season, this means getting to know new candidates, particularly in open or competitive districts, and showing up to interact with the incumbent, because they're going to be out there too, wherever they are in the district. And the goal is that whoever ends up representing you in the next Congress takes office already knowing and respecting CCL and supporting our legislation. Okay. So the second area is engaging key community influencers to gain their support and create opportunities for them to talk with members of Congress. So in the next 6 months in particular, we think that approaching local elected officials, for example, city council people, county supervisors, state legislators, we think that that's going to be most productive because those folks are really going to be crossing paths a lot with the federal candidates and with your member of Congress a lot during campaign season. So, and our goal then is for the candidates and the incumbents to hear from people that they trust. And then the next area, the last area highlighted here is bipartisanship. Danny already spoke to that. Basically, we encourage you to use every avenue, one-on-one conversations, reaching out to community leaders, letters to the editor, putting it in your presentations, putting it in your social media. And our goal there is to generate support for a bill with sponsors from both major parties. Okay, so there's more details on the other pages and some additional topics, all right? And again, we don't expect your group to do all of them. It's okay if you do. But we count on you to figure that out. And remember that this organization is a team sport. So what you get done in your area is magnified by what gets done across the country. What might seem small to you in your district, added up across the country becomes much, much bigger. And we really look forward to hearing what you're doing. So those other topics include creating and using good stories, strengthening your chapter by diversifying it, helping us reach every district, and getting out there and educating your community. All right, so just one more thing. I have found over and over that as important as having a clear plan of action is, and that's important, my attitude to the work is even more important. How I feel when I get out of bed is even more important. And maintaining the right perspective on things really takes as much internal discipline as keeping track of my list of things to do. So here's one of the things that helps me do that. Some years ago, Jay Butera, who was the driving force behind the forming of the Climate Solutions Caucus, he wrote a personal statement called Why I Act on Climate. He reads it to himself every day. If you've been around a few years, you've heard this already. But remember, there's a lot of new folks here who haven't heard it yet. So that's what I'm going to close with. This is Jay's statement of why I act on climate. I believe that I can have a major impact on the fate of our planet if I work tirelessly toward climate solutions, think big, and act fearlessly. I believe that bold actions by a few brave people, I'm looking at them, can change the course of history and stabilize the Earth's climate. I believe I am one of those people. Doing this will not be easy or comfortable, but it is definitely possible. And since it's possible, I must try. I will not give up. All right. So thank you, Jay, for giving us this. Thanks to all of you. We're on to our regional breakouts now.